Good evening and welcome to Tonight with Tim Modise. On the program, we will discuss the role of the church in our personal and public lives and discuss the stubborn problem of road collisions and fatalities over long weekends. Welcome. This is Tonight with Tim Modise. The church and various religious groups have played a critical part in the well-being of individual citizens and in the fight for justice, especially during the apartheid South Africa. The church has been seen as a spiritual voice and conscience of the people, but in recent times it has been implicated in money-making schemes, abuse of members, and most recently violent crimes, including murder. One leading religious leader in our society is the Methodist Bishop Paul Verryn, who has been an activist and has administered to individuals and communities in distress. He continues to do his work in Greater Johannesburg and other parts of the country. And he's here to talk to us about the relevance of the church in communities of the democratic South Africa. Bishop Veryn, pleasure to be with you on the program.
Thank you.
And you, if I may say so, have been a household name for sometimes wrong or dubious reasons. You can explain that for yourselves. But precisely because you've been very active in the lives of the communities that you serve, having served in Joburg for quite a long time now, almost 30 years, if not more. How long in Joburg?
Well, I was in a church in Roodepoort and was connected to the SACC from 1984.
So it's quite a while.
And then moved into Soweto in 1987.
And you're still,
Yes.
you're still there in
Yes.
Soweto. And you have seen all kinds of things, especially in the 80s, when it was the police pitted against the community against the police, mass uprisings, the state of emergencies, when people were pushing for the release of Mandela, unbanning of political organizations, and of course, the demise of apartheid. It was a very turbulent and violent time at that time, with children getting arrested in the process. Just briefly tell me about that experience.
Well, you know, I was involved with the Detainees Parent Support Committee and also then involved with a group called the Detainees Counselling Service, which worked with a national group of medical doctors. Because what we were finding is people coming out of detention struggling with post-traumatic stress and really battling to get their lives back into order because of all sorts of psychological and physical difficulties.
And of course, during that time, in the late 80s, around 1990, 89 or thereabouts, then the story of Stompie Seipei emerged.
That's
And how did you get involved, and what is your take of what transpired at the time?
Well, he was brought to my house, actually, by Matthew Chaskelson and Ace Magashule to look after him. He stayed with other children who were young people who were on the run in the Methodist manse in Orlando. And he was taken from there by the Mandela Football Club, and then, as we know, eventually ended up, I participated in his funeral in Tumahole in January.
And when you reflect back to the events of the time, how do you feel? I mean, what is your recollection?
Well, obviously a very, very traumatic time. I mean, some of the things that were happening to young people, you know, in terms of torture, going right down to the age of 10. So you had young people who were beaten. For instance, there was a young man I can remember clearly that I saw who had lifted his hand to protect himself, and his hand was broken. There were young people who alleged that they had been electrified in their genitals. There was a young boy of 10 years old who alleged that he'd been put into a coffin with a corpse to force him to speak. And I think that many of them broke under that kind of torture and then would come and re-enter the society, and sometimes the real struggle with their own integrity and the memories left them feeling very alienated and broken.
And that was then?
Yeah, that was in the right into 1988, 89.
And this is a big subject on its own, what you've just told me, and I'm aware you're just giving me a summary of what happened. But do you think that things have improved in terms of how the authorities, because most of this was done by the police and the government at the time, but even on the side of the liberation movement or the activist movement, these things were being done against those that were suspected to be mpimpis, isn't it?
And that was the pain around Stompie.
Yes.
He was, I think, quite clearly, even at the age of 10, an effective leader amongst the young children in Tumahole. But there were suspicions about his being an impimpi.
Yes.
I think ultimately that might well have been the cause of his death.
Yeah.
There still is speculation around that.
Exactly. But that gives a sense of the kinds of things that people like yourselves, who were supposed to administer the Christian faith and look after members of your church, you got involved in the activism of the time, having to look after the rights of the children who were being subjected to this and become activists in your own right. Now, the change after 1994, did it lessen the burden on you and other ministers from getting involved in community affairs, especially those of a social, political kind?
I think that part of the essence of what it means to be church is in actual fact involvement in community. Whether it is in the healing of people's memories, whether it is in the beginning of trying to mobilize the empowerment of people. The church can't sit in an ivory tower divorced from society and just do religious stuff. I think that the church constantly has to be in dialogue with the life circumstances and context that people face on a daily basis.
You got involved a few years back, for instance, in one of the big issues, if one may call it that, of the time. I think even your church was opposed to what you were doing when you took people in who had come to South Africa probably illegally, Zimbabweans, and they said you could not provide a home for them in the church, and you're exposing them to all kinds of health hazards and so forth. It was a big controversial issue for you then. Tell me a bit more about it.
Well, it's interesting where we started this conversation, because I would have adults arriving in the church and really struggling with trauma. And then they would, of course, arrive in Johannesburg and maybe in a very short time be robbed of their clothes, of their money, of their certificates, and the trauma would be reinforced. And you can imagine, as a minister of religion, for me to say thank you. It was very interesting listening to your story. Thank you. I've made a few notes, and God bless you. Then to send them back into the city with no place to stay, with no way of sustaining themselves at all. And so very conservatively, to begin with, we opened a room for people, and for quite a long time we didn't have very many more than 20, 30 people in the building. And then, of course,
the numbers grew.
It grew exponentially.
Well, and again, for people who are familiar with your work and other ministers who were involved in that kind of work, it was beginning to be taken for granted that that is what the church will do. But things changed, maybe not so new, but it is widespread now, where we find churches mushrooming, said to be illegal, irregular, and with some strange practices taking place there. People being fed snakes and others being sprayed with insecticide. Doom is the preferred one, it appears. I don't know why doom and not any other.
It's quite a killer.
It's quite a killer. And people being charged lots of money. And these churches are now very popular. And of course, the sad part is, and tragic one, is the most recent story from the Eastern Cape of the 7 angels who killed several police officers, and people held against their will. These are things that are being associated with the church in recent times. Why do you think that there is an increase of such practices within the new emergent churches?
You know, I think from the beginning of the history of the church, it has always needed to struggle with issues of accountability. We're a very religious country. I mean, you can come to any, for instance, Sunday, let me talk from the Christian perspective, and you will see millions of people, literally, going to places of worship. And of course, the churches very often have enormous influence on people's sense of identity, worth, meaning in life, and all that sort of stuff. And so, too, it can become a place of abuse. And of course, the important thing for us to remember is that because it's religious, doesn't necessarily mean that it cannot be held to account for the legality or the criminality of what's going on in the church. And so the church, right from the beginning of its existence, has constantly had a facility of calling into question some really off-the-wall ideas and practices, and has had to discipline in those cases. The church, for instance, that I belong to, on a yearly basis, all its clergy are subjected to questions of accountability. Is there any objection to their moral or religious character? Is there any objection on the grounds that they do not believe and preach our doctrines? So that system of me being able to say to some other person in the religious faith, this is not acceptable. This has got nothing to do with what we practice as Christians. In actual fact, this is either heresy or this is criminal. We do have those.
So a peer review mechanism of sorts.
Yes.
Now, in the case of these new churches, that kind of thing is not taking place, I suppose. And from where I'm sitting, and a few people I know think that it's a new escalating phenomenon. It's actually growing in an escalating manner. Is it the case, you think, from where you're sitting, and what could be the reason for that, if it is growing in that way?
If it's growing, it might be growing because there is a great sense of desperation for many marginalized people in the country. And I'm aware of the fact that these churches don't only deal with the poorest of the poor. They sometimes cater for the richest of the rich. I would be anxious to give you a very specific reason. I would also be very anxious about saying, yes, it's growing. I think that there have been the religiously insane around for many, many years.
So there's nothing new. It's
no,
just
no,
that,
no.
But maybe the awareness is much more pronounced now than before.
Well, it's definitely more exposed, I think. Yeah. I mean, let me go to my own scriptures and say, there were certain things, for instance, that Jesus had to confront in terms of a very fundamental, simplistic interpretation of what faith is about. You know, so a woman gets brought to him, and there are scriptures that say, if you get caught in adultery, you must be stoned. And he begins a new narrative for her entire life. But in actual fact, in a very narrow-minded sense, he is now going against the flow of that very rigid kind of religiosity.
Well, it's Easter weekend now, and a lot of people will be flocking to their respective places of worship. What is the key thing for those who still have a sense of spirituality to reflect on during times like these, from your own practice as a leader and a teacher? You know, for individuals when they go to these places, and even when they are by themselves, what are the key things that you think they should focus on, reflect on during these times?
I think one of the key things is, of course, to try and open more doors in terms of the understanding of God's love for us. And the nuances of Christ's humility, the nuances of the sacrifice of his life on behalf of people. His whole reconstruction of power and what power is about. And obviously it's a time of deep reflection for all of us in terms of our complicity in the creation of pain in humanity, in the places where we feel overconfident and absolutely right, like perhaps Peter did, where we've got to scrutinize our use of money as Judas did. So it's a time of cleaning out the cupboards.
Bishop Paul Verryn, thank you very much for talking to us.
Thank you very much.
Much appreciated. That's the Bishop Paul Verryn. And in a moment, we will be looking at road safety issues over the Easter weekend.